Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Yeager, Director of Heritage Programs for Missouri Humanities. Our mission is to enrich lives and strengthen communities by connecting Missourians with the people, places, and ideas that shape our society. Thank you so much for joining us today for our program commemorating Women's History Month, Missouri Women, Trailblazing Our Past, Inspiring Our Present, presented by Greta Russell. Whether you're joining us through Zoom or watching on Facebook Live, we invite you to be part of the conversation. If you're on Facebook, feel free to comment to let us know you're watching or to ask questions for us to consider. If you're on Zoom, feel free to submit questions using the chat feature or the Q&A feature, and we'll try to answer as many as possible towards the end of our time today. If you enjoy our program and are interested in seeing more from Missouri Humanities, please check us out on Facebook or on our website for the most up-to-date information about our events. We also have a membership program where benefits include free books, discounted tickets to special programs, and access to members-only events. Joining is super easy. Just visit www.mohumanities.org and click Become a Member. One last housekeeping item. At the conclusion of our program today, a link to our program survey will pop up on your screen. I'd really appreciate it if you could all take just a few minutes to fill that out and let us know what you thought of the presentation today. These surveys are so important to us as we continue our work toward a more thoughtful, informed, and civil society. I am very excited to introduce our speaker for our program today, Greta Russell. Greta launched her career in museums and historic sites after earning a master's degree in museum studies from the Fashion Institute of Technology. After 16 years working with museum collections and historic sites in Missouri, Greta journeyed west to Cody, Wyoming, and is currently the senior registrar at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Greta started documenting Missouri women's history in 2007 on the blog MissouriWomen.org. To date, more than 50 women's stories and historic sites have been documented there. So I'd like to turn this over to Greta, and Greta will get us going on our discussion of some marvelous Missouri women. Greta, go right ahead.
Hello, thank you. Thank you all for joining me today to learn a little bit about some of the Missouri women who have been inspirational to me. And thank you to the Missouri Humanities Council for highlighting women during Women's History Month. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the blog that I created, some of the women's stories, and some sites that can be visited in Missouri to learn more about women's history. So, like Caitlin mentioned, I used to live in Missouri. I lived there for about 15 years. I have moved to Wyoming. I am talking to you today from northwest corner of Wyoming, near Yellowstone National Park. And I moved here for my job. I work at a complex of museums here, and my background is in museums and historic sites. And that's really what got me interested in learning more about women's history. I felt that it was kind of lacking in the historic sites that were being preserved in Missouri, which really fueled a desire in me to learn more about what women were doing in the state that had come before me. I really was interested in learning about shared experiences and that shared humanity from what other women had done with their lives. In 2009, I started a blog, MissouriWomen.org, in order to basically document the stories that I had learned about and the places that I found to visit. So this blog was really just my avenue to dig into some of these stories. I didn't have any money, I didn't have any influence of any kind, but I had some time and the interest and the desire to learn more about these women. So today, the website really is a resource center for people to learn about women's history in the state. I've documented over 50 women's stories. I know there's a lot more out there to learn about. I have an interactive map that has over 40 locations documented. There are resources and books, and I've developed a printable exhibition that's also available on the website. And I found that over the years, this website has really filled a need as a resource for especially elementary students who are researching the state's history in 4th grade. And, you know, I've had librarians tell me that some students can't really find resources out there about women in the state. So this website has really been able to expand those resources for kids. So the image that you're seeing right now, that's me on the right-hand side of your screen. That image is from 2015 when I had done a lot of research on the suffragette Alice Curtis Moyer wing. And I had a great opportunity to work with some state agencies in order to put up these interpretive signs at the old Greenville recreation area near Lake Wapapello in southeast Missouri. And it was really great to be able to see these efforts to document Missouri women's history come to fruition with projects like these. So today I'm going to talk with you about a few women who really have inspired me. And I'm going to do that in chronological order. So we'll start from the late 1700s and go up into about 1940. And then after I talk about these women's stories and some places to visit, I will show you my blog and go over a few of the features and how to navigate the site. So I first wanted to start with St. Rose Philippine Duquesne. She was a missionary who came to Missouri in 1818. And she is an example of a woman who was really inspired to action by her spirituality and by her faith and her religious beliefs to make the world better and to help people. Rose Duquesne was a nun. She was born in France, and she became a nun when she was a teen against her family's wishes. But her lifelong dream and her lifelong mission was to bring religion and care to the Native Americans. And so she came to the United States when she was in her 40s in 1818, which I find really interesting because I think she was 49 when she wound up coming to Missouri. And I think it's really interesting that she did it at that point in her life, because a lot of times we think, you know, I'm in my 40s, I've had kids, or I've had a career, I can't like go on a new venture. And I find it really inspiring and interesting that she did just that. Rose Duquesne established schools in St. Charles. She established a school for white girls to come to the school. And at the time, she thought it was so important to teach slaves and teach Native Americans that she negotiated with the bishop in order to open up the school on Saturdays for slaves and Native Americans to come in and learn. She built new schools and convents up and down the Mississippi River, a large school and orphanage in St. Louis. And again, that she had that call and that desire to live and die with the Native Americans. And she grew very frustrated because the bishop didn't appoint her to that work. And that was the work that she felt called to do. In 1833, she said, "It has always been my ambition to die among the Indians, but at close range, one sees that one cannot hope for that. And where there seems to be reality, one finds only a beautiful dream." It wasn't until she was 72 years old that she was appointed to serve at the Potawatomi Reservation at the Catholic Mission and School in Kansas. And Pierre-Jean Desmet said, "She must come. She may not be able to do much work, but she will assure success to the mission by praying for us. Her very presence will draw down all manner of heavenly favors on the work." Rose Duquesne became known as the woman who prays always by the Potawatomi because she would stay in meditative prayer for hours. And there's this story of this boy who came up to her while she was in prayer and put these kernels of corn on the back of her robes in the folds. And he came back the next morning and they were still exactly in that spot. They hadn't even moved. And that was her dedication to her faith, because she was in that meditative prayer for so many hours. So Rose Duquesne eventually returned back to St. Charles because of old age. She passed away in 1852. She was canonized as a saint in 1988. And she was a very devout teacher. And she believed in helping people. And I think it's that call to help people which I find really inspiring about her story and acting on that faith. So there are two sites that you can visit about her in Missouri. The convent that she established and lived at for 14 years is open as a historic site. The old St. Ferdinand Shrine in Florissant, which you see on the right side of your screen. And you can also visit the site where her remains are interred at the school that she founded in St. Charles. So along with the missionaries in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there was an influx of white settlement into Missouri. And today I'm going to talk to you about Olive Boone and Hinakol, whose stories are really interesting to highlight. You know, unfortunately, we don't know a lot about what these women really thought. We don't know about their motivations, their inner thoughts and that sort of thing, because a lot of them couldn't read or write and they didn't have legal rights at that time. So there are hundreds of stories of women of this time period that are lost to time because of those reasons. Now we know a little bit about Olive Boone and Hinakol because they were married to well-known men. And Hinakol established a ferry at Booneville, and her home eventually became a fort, and it was used for different purposes, like the first school, and there were government meetings held there and that sort of thing after her husband's death. So we know that she played a really integral part in settlement of that part of the state, but we don't really know her inner thoughts or motivations. And there is a really great statue to Hinakol that you see pictured on the right side of your screen that you can go and visit in Booneville. And we don't know really what she looked like, but this is the statue that they had erected in her honor. On the left side, you see a photograph of Olive Boone, and she was married to Nathan Boone. So some of her life in Missouri is known because her husband was a well-known guy. And when he was interviewed and told stories about his life later in life, he, tangentially kind of talked about his wife's experience and that sort of thing. There is one quote that exists from Olive Boone when she talks about how her and her husband arrived to Missouri, and she says, "We crossed the river at St. Charles by placing our goods on a skiff. My husband rowed and I steered and held the horse by the bridle. It was rather a perilous trip for so young a couple. I was 16, my husband 18. So it's kind of inspiring to think about this young couple starting their life out together and, crossing the river there at St. Charles when they arrived in Missouri. And of course, it was Louisiana Territory at that time. So there are two historic homes preserved that you can visit that tell the story of Nathan and Olive Boone. One of them is in Defiance, that you see on the left side of your screen, and the other one is in Ash Grove. Nathan and Olive first settled in Defiance at the site of where you see that large stone home pictured. And before they built that home, they of course settled in log cabins that they lived in on this property. And this is where Nathan talks about Olive's experiences early on when they had first settled in Missouri. And he talks about how Olive and her slave, they were alone and they had to build this floor in the log cabin and they had to build a chimney in the log cabin. So the stories help us understand the experiences that these women went through, the details of the materials that they needed and the hardships and that sort of thing. And like I mentioned, the other home is open to the public and it's preserved in Ash Grove, Missouri. So for Hinakol's life, you can visit the site of the fort that she established. It's marked with a historic marker in Booneville. And the photograph on the right is of her gravesite, which is next to a roadside park that's named in her honor. And then there's also that statue located in Booneville. So I think these women, the early settler experience, it's really inspirational just because of the nature of life at that time. You know, they had to be tough and rugged and resourceful. And I also find it really interesting that along with all those hardships of the frontier, they were also having children. I know that Olive had 14 children. And so every other year she's having a baby along with all the other things that she had to do just to survive. So thoughts along those lines help to kind of flesh out those experiences as well. So along with those early settler experiences come the stories of slaves and Native Americans. And even less is known about their experiences and their lives. It's hard to imagine all the hundreds of stories of these women that are just lost to time. And I will say, this is a very needed addition to my website. So if anyone has stories or information about these women, I would love to follow up on those. I did want to highlight the life of Celia. And on the left side of your screen, you see a book that has been written about her life. It chronicles her experiences and the lawsuit that resulted from her life. And it's a really interesting story, so I would recommend that to anyone who's interested in this. Celia was purchased by a farmer named Robert Newsom when she was 14 years old in 1850, and she was purchased as his concubine. On the way home from the slave auction, she was raped, and she was raped repeatedly for the next 5 years. And she had some of his children as well. In 1855, Celia had had enough. One night when he came into her cabin, she hit him over the head with a stick, and he died. She burned his body and buried his body. Well, when Robert came up missing, Celia was a suspect in his murder. And so she eventually was charged with murder. There was a jury trial, and her defense lawyer argued that Celia killed Newsom as an act of self-defense after she had been repeatedly sexually assaulted. But the judge in the case told the jury, and the jury was made up of white farmers, some of them slave owners, that they could not acquit based on self-defense or sexual assault because laws don't apply to slaves. So Celia was found guilty, sentenced to execution, and she was hanged in December of 1855. Well, like I mentioned, not much exists of these stories directly from the women themselves. There is an interview with Celia, and a quote from that interview states, "As soon as I struck him, the devil got into me, and I struck him with a stick until he was dead, and then rolled him in the fire and burnt him up." Well, Celia, of course, was not given a fair trial. She had no rights under the law for personal protection. And we can only imagine what her life was like and the circumstances that led her to make the choices that she made. And a lot of stories of this time are lost to time because of this power inequity at that point in history. But I believe stories like Celia's are really critical. Unfortunately, we don't know where Celia is buried, but the farm location is known and it is really well documented. I've marked it on the map that you see on the right side of your screen, and it is south of Fulton. So there's been extensive archaeology to make sure that this site is well documented. And I think that this would be one site that would be fantastic to save and be interpreted and open to the public. I have heard that there is a candlelight vigil every year on the anniversary of Celia's death in the town of Fulton. Well, Civil War women in Missouri, you know, their stories are so interesting and varied because Missouri was a border state and was very divided in how people were approaching that conflict. And some women, you know, did not get involved. Some women were sent away. Some were spies. You know, there's all these varied experiences. And I think that Adeline Cousin's story is really inspiring and interesting just because she was spurred into action by this conflict. And I'm always interested to think about what choices women made at the time they were living based on those confines that they were living within from their time period. So Adeline Cousins, she decided to help and do what she could. She established the St. Louis Ladies Union Aid Society, and these were the women that were greeting trains of wounded soldiers. They were making supplies to help. They were traveling to battlefields like Wilson's Creek. And they weren't, Adeline was not shying away from going right to the front lines to help out and use her skills as a nurse to help wounded soldiers. She was shot in the leg and wounded at Vicksburg when she was at the front lines to help out. And, as she was getting older, this wound was giving her a lot of trouble when she got into her old age. But being a woman volunteer, she wasn't entitled to any sort of pension from the federal government. And again, she chose to act. She petitioned the government for a pension in her older age. And on the left side of your screen, you see the report that accompanied that petition that she made to the government. There is a doctor's quote on the petition that says, "Mrs. Cousins' efforts were not spasmodic. She worked steadily. When not in the field, she was looking after the sick in our hospitals. Her attention was not alone given to sick and wounded Union soldiers. The sick and wounded prisoners who were sent to our city in large numbers claimed her attention and care. I presume there was not a day from the arrival of our first wounded from the Battle of Wilson's Creek to the close of the war that Mrs. Cousins was not engaged in the service of mercy and patriotism." So she did get her pension, but it took a special act of Congress to grant her that pension. She received $30 a month starting on October 1st of 1888. And I think her story is really inspiring because she did choose to act. When people needed her skills as a nurse, she didn't sit idly by. She went to help out. I also find it really inspiring that she pushed for gender equality with getting that pension from the government. She demanded equal treatment as anyone else got who was wounded on the battlefield. So over on the right side of your screen, you see her gravesite in Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis and the grave marker. And early on in this project, I found that her grave was unmarked. And so we worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs and got some donations to get this grave marked. She was eligible for the veterans marker because she received that pension. And I did want to mention that Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis, there's a lot of really interesting stories that are really well documented about women on their website. So at the same time, there was another battle going on in Missouri, and that was the battle for equal suffrage for women. And Missouri women were very involved in this movement. Virginia Minor established the Women's Suffrage Association of Missouri in 1867 to secure the ballot for women upon terms of equality with men. Soon, she became really entangled in a national debate about women's voting rights. In 1869, she said, "I believe the Constitution of the United States gives me every right and privilege to which every other citizen is entitled. For while the Constitution gives the states the right to regulate suffrage, it nowhere gives them power to prevent it." So what she's saying here is that women already had the right to vote under the 14th Amendment. And in 1872, she led a nationwide movement for women to attempt to register to vote. So how did she lead this movement? She attempted to register to vote, and then she was denied. And there were other women nationally that were doing this as well. So after she was denied the right to register to vote, her husband then sued the Register of Voters, because at this time, of course, women could not file a lawsuit. They had to have a man to do that on their behalf. So Virginia Minor claimed that it was illegal to deny her the right to vote under the 14th Amendment. She was a legal citizen, so she should be able to vote. The case was heard at the old courthouse of St. Louis and eventually went to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that voting did not correspond with citizenship. So these women failed at the national level, and it would take almost 50 more years in order for them to receive the right to vote. So she lost, but I think from her story, we learn that change takes time and effort and pressure from different angles. Instead of giving up, she tried and failed, but her efforts and the efforts of women throughout the country were really important in building momentum and moving this change forward. So after this happened, women shifted to petitioning state by state for voting rights. And I find her story really inspiring because of how they organized and how they communicated and how they were, being a part of something bigger than themselves to enact this change. So you can visit the Old Courthouse Museum in St. Louis and learn more about her story. They have great educational and interpretive materials there. And Virginia Minor is also buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery. Alice Curtis Moyer Wing is a great example of a suffragette that was fighting for voting rights at a very grassroots level. She grew up in Southwest Missouri, in Buffalo, and she got married young, and she became a widow and had 2 children that she had to take care of. So she traveled to Kansas and Texas for her work. She worked as a businesswoman. She was a stenographer and she was a writer. So she was traveling everywhere, just making a living for herself and her children. And eventually she settled in St. Louis. And she really put herself right on the front lines of this fight for voting rights. In 1916, she faced a very angry mob of men where she was actually choked by a man who threatened her life if she kept speaking for equal voting rights. So this was dangerous work for these women. Changing minds about gender equality was not easy, and new ideas were not welcome. And so what did she do after this assault? She wound up moving to Greenville in Southeast Missouri, but she did not stop her efforts to change people's minds about voting rights. She wound up traveling the Eastern Ozarks on horseback. She met all sorts of different characters to talk to about voting rights and gender equality. And she wrote about her experiences in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. So not only was she traveling out on a very grassroots level to meet people and change minds, but she was also using her literary talents to write about her experiences, and in that way reached a whole new audience through the articles in the Post-Dispatch. So Alice writes that she grew up in an Ozarks homestead, and she is tough enough to travel the Ozarks on horseback and talk to anyone she comes across about voting rights. Her articles are about the highs and lows of this process, the support that she finds, but also how she must try and change so many people's minds, not only about voting rights, but this deeper issue of gender equality. So the arguments that she came across in her work was that women needed to be nurtured because they're weaker than men, and women will only vote as their husbands vote. So there's no point in having equal voting rights, or women are too emotional to handle the responsibilities of being able to vote. And she presents herself as this crusader that must travel the Ozarks and convince people that women have the capability to vote. They should vote. They are already doing a lot of the same work as men. And so in the Ozarks, and so, you know, they should be equal and they should be voting. Photos and illustrations accompanied her articles, and I've shown 3 here on the screen. And at the top, it's a picture of Alice Curtis Moyer Wing in the center with 2 women, Janie and Pansy, that she writes about meeting one day in her travels. And she talks about how relieved she is to meet these 2 women who support voting rights. And their reasoning for supporting voting rights is, you know, they say that men are always playing jokes on women, and keeping the vote from them is just one more joke that they have played on women. They tell Alice that when she's riding up on horseback, she looks like the goddess Liberty. And they ask her, why is Liberty represented as a female when liberty and freedoms are not extended to females? And Alice says she doesn't really know the reason. And so these 2 women say, you know, it's just another cruel joke that men have played on women, and we should be equal and we should have the same rights as them. The photograph that you see on the right of Nini, in this article, Alice meets Nini, who tells her this whole story of the conflict that she's been in with her boyfriend, Nick, who says that, you know, women are too quick to anger and they can't handle the responsibilities of voting, because he's seen Nini out with the goats. And when she's trying to get the goats in the pasture, she gets too angry. And so Nini talks to Alice about how when Nick brought some mules home, he was trying to break the mules, and the mules would not plow, and the mules ended up running off. And Nick yelled and screamed, and eventually he laid down and cried. And so Nini talks to Alice about how, you know, she went to Nick and she said, look, you had the same anger response as me, and women and men are exactly the same in that way. And so Nini says she changed her boyfriend's mind by pointing out the hypocrisy in what he was saying. And because they had the same anger response, they should have the same equal rights when it comes to voting. So these articles are really an avenue for her to discuss the different and varied arguments made against voting equality and to combat those with her values and her ideals. And ultimately, this was successful, and women did receive the vote in 1920. So after voting equality came to Missouri, Alice eventually ran for Congress and she lost. In the 1920s, she was appointed State Industrial Inspector. She was the first woman to head a state department in Missouri, and she worked for a 9-hour workday for women, child labor laws. She appointed women to inspector positions, and she was very insistent that they make the same salary as men. So in doing this work, Alice commuted from her home in Greenville to St. Louis, to Kansas City, and Jefferson City to serve in that capacity. And I find that she's really inspirational because she spoke her mind, even after being assaulted for her beliefs. She continued to face people who had different opinions than she did, and she stood up for her beliefs. She wasn't shy. She didn't shy away from conflict. She expressed her desire and reasons for change. And ultimately, she was working for what she believed was a higher good and motivated by that idea of gender equality. So the sites that you can visit about Alice, her gravesite is located outside of Greenville, and you can see that in the picture on the right. And also I mentioned the old Greenville Recreation Area, which is close to Lake Wapapello. It commemorates the town that was flooded for the dam at Lake Wapapello. Well, there are a lot of women artists and singers and writers from Missouri who worked in Missouri or drew inspiration from the state. It's hard to just hone in on a few to highlight because there are so many really interesting women's stories. We've all heard of Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Little House on the Prairie books. Laura came to Missouri in 1894 and wrote the books in Mansfield at Rocky Ridge Farm. It was not easy for Laura and her husband to make a living, and so she started writing a column in the Missouri Ruralist called As the Farm Woman Thinks. She started doing that in 1911 just to supplement her income. And she was also really compelled to reflect on her life as she grew older. And I think that's really relatable. The idea that as you get older, you kind of have a reckoning with your life and things that you've done and analyzing things in the past. And she also wanted to leave these stories for other people, the stories of her life, which I think is interesting. Laura's daughter, Rose Welder Lane, was also a writer and helped Laura get her books published. There's some debate about, if Rose possibly wrote some of the books or heavily edited them, and whether she did or not, there's no denying that they've had a huge cultural impact. The books have been very, very popular. So Laura writes about her life. She was born in the 1860s in Wisconsin, and she writes about her childhood stories and her family on the frontier. They moved from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to South Dakota. And the experiences are kind of typical for a frontier family, a pioneer family, but her writing is extraordinary. She writes about the joys and struggles, the pioneer experience, their family life, and the games and jokes that they play. And people can really relate to these stories over time and the shared humanity in them. Finding a publisher was not easy for Laura. They were not published until 1931, when she was 64 years old. And they have been very successful. There's been a lot of sequels made of them. They've been in continual print and all those things. And one thing I really find inspiring about her and her story is that it wasn't until she was in her 60s that they were published. And again, I think a lot of us think, I've done this, I can't start something else because I am a certain age. And I find inspiration from these women who have done that. In terms of sites that you can visit, in Mansfield, you can visit the Rocky Ridge Farm and Museum. The museum is really fantastic and gives a lot of information about Laura and her family, and especially her daughter, Rose Lane, who had a very rich and full life as a writer on her own terms. Laura's buried in Mansfield, and she is also featured in the Hall of Famous Missourians in Jefferson City. Well, the last woman that I'll talk about today is Rose O'Neill. Rose was an artist and an illustrator, and she lived at a home north of Branson called Bonnybrook. And Rose O'Neill was born in Pennsylvania in 1870, and she moved to Nebraska. And when she was a teenager, she started illustrating, and she went to New York City to start her career there. And her father wound up moving to the Ozarks and purchasing the property that would become Bonnybrook, where she would live, like I said, north of Branson. And Rose is most well-known or most famous for creating the Kewpie, which you see on the screen here, the cute little babies. And this was the first mass-marketed toy in the United States. Rose was a very serious artist, writer, and illustrator. At one point, she was the highest paid female illustrator in the United States. And she launched her Kewpies in 1909. And these dolls were very famous, and they made her very wealthy, and she was very successful. She had homes in New York and Connecticut and Italy, and she lived and worked in France for a time. But what's most interesting about Rose is that, she used her art, her illustrations, and her Kewpies to promote her ideals and her values, specifically about the women's movement. And the things that were fundamentally important to her: gender equality, voting rights, and pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable for women. Like I mentioned, Rose was a world traveler, but she moved to the Ozarks in the 1930s full-time and lived at Bonnybrook, and you can see the home on the right side of your screen. And some say there's these two sides to Rose, that she had her serious artwork and then the Cupies. But the Cupies were really a pop cultural phenomenon that she really cleverly used to not only get across her values, but also to raise money. She was very generous, and she helped people, children in need, and causes that were important to her. So today you can visit Bonnybrook, and there's the museum there, as well as the home dedicated to her life, and learn about her story, both how she lived at the home, which she opened up as an artist commune, and her artwork. And what I thought was very interesting about the historic site was that you can see the setting where she created her sweet monsters. On the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you can see what she called her sweet monsters, and they were kind of like this amalgam of nature and human forms. And she said that she would see these creatures in the Ozark vegetation around the home. The home on the lower left corner of your screen is in Springfield, and that is the home that she built for her nephew. And that's also the home where she passed away. She built this home, like I said, for her nephew because he needed help at the time. And the home was actually supposed to be torn down, but there was a group of women at the university that fought to save it. And the university today has it open for students to learn about her artwork, to carry on her nonconformist legacy, and to live and study there. So I really think Rose is inspiring at how she pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable for women at the time, by her lifestyle, her art, the clothing that she wore, and how she took that acceptable image of the Cupid and made it her venue to talk about her values and to change minds. So now we're going to hop over to the website, and I'll show you a little bit about the blog. Like I said, it is at MissouriWomen.org. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a brief overview about the website. So I'm hoping that this talk today can inspire you to learn a little bit about some of the women's history in your part of the state. To learn about some of the stories I've featured, you can click on women right here, and this will bring up a alphabetical list of some of the women that I've featured, and I know that there are many more women's stories out there to be documented. And so you can click on any of these, which will just bring up the blog posts that I've written about that woman. And in the blog post, I have documented sites to go and visit and a little bit about their story and their history. And we've also included photos of sites to see and other resources and other websites to learn about that woman. I've also got an interactive map where I have been able to track the locations that I've written about over the years. So if you click on the view larger map, you can kind of zoom in and take a look at the sites we've had that we have documented. So you can see here we've got Carrie Nation's grave and Clarice Dover's grave site. So this gives you kind of just an overview of some of the sites that I've been able to document over the years. Resources is a list of books that I found helpful and really interesting. Some of these I've written about on the blog, and I've also got a printable exhibit that can be downloaded. I found that I was getting a lot of requests for Women's History Month, and sometimes people just kind of needed something to put up on a bulletin board or whatever, so we've got that here. On the main page of the website, on the left, you've got all my blog posts that are in reverse chronological order. Most recently, these are articles by Alice Curtis Moyer Wing that are reprinted from the Post-Dispatch to dive a little bit deeper into her story. And then over on the right side under links, there are links that go out to other websites about women's history. So that's all I've got for today. I hope that I've inspired you to seek out some women's history in your area. I know there's a lot more to learn about.
Thank you so much, Greta. That was I have to say, there are actually some women in there that I hadn't heard of either. So I'm sure that means that others are not as well known as well. So we appreciate all the time and dedication to telling these stories. We do have a few questions. One is, I've gotten this question twice now, so I'll go ahead and answer that, which is if this is being recorded and can be shared or viewed later. The answer to that is yes. It's currently playing live on our Facebook page. So it'll be housed there as a video on our Facebook page. So that page is Missouri Humanities Council, and then it'll be under our videos tab. And that'll be available within minutes of the program completing. So you're welcome to share that on your Facebook pages. The other place you'll be able to view this, it won't be immediate. It'll probably be within the next week. This will be housed on Missouri Humanities video archive on our website. So, but we have to format it into a YouTube video and then put it on our website. So it'll take a little bit of time. But you're able to view this program and lots of other past programs on mohumanities.org/videos. So, and from there, it's a simple YouTube link that you can email, share, view again and again and again. So have fun with that. But yes, I think this is definitely a presentation to share with daughters, granddaughters, friends, anybody that you think might benefit or be interested in the content. I think we could all stand to learn a little bit more about Missouri women's history. So yes, please share far and wide. And Greta, that goes for you too. if you now you have a recording of a presentation for you. A couple questions that are coming up. Linda asks if you can talk a little bit more about how Rose O'Neill used the QP to promote gender equality.
Yeah, I had showed on my presentation the votes for our mothers, and she had used those kind of as advertisements for voting rights to try and change minds and I think kind of make it more acceptable to people who may not agree with voting rights. If you see a cute baby saying, "My mom should vote," that kind of makes it easier to understand or easier to accept, maybe.
I already answered that. So you had a list of resources like books and articles and such on your website, and I saw that it was quite extensive. But Jody wants to know about any other books you recommend that a library might carry. I did notice that a lot of the books that you saw, or at least what you had briefly scrolled through, were about specific women. So maybe more overarching books about Missouri women's history in general, or just maybe even some of your favorites that you felt were the most compelling to you. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, as far as an overview, in St. Louis, the In Her Place, I believe, is a really big, like more comprehensive book about a lot of women in St. Louis. An overview for only women, I don't know if that even exists right now. I
Looks
know
like you've
that
got some that are a little bit more maybe time period related. And I see that showing me Missouri women, and I saw one about the 60s, maybe women in the 60s.
yeah. Oh, sorry. I think any of these books would be great for a library to have. I don't know that there's like one comprehensive one. I know this one is a like historical fiction. So I'm not sure how relevant that sort of thing would be if you're looking for an overview. And yeah, a lot of these are biographies that I was consulting in order to write my blog posts. So yeah.
Yeah, it looks like a great list. Kay wants to know, she's got kind of a two-part question. Are you sponsored financially by anyone or any business? I'm assuming they mean your blog. Any sort of financial support that you get?
No, this was just a passion project. I was just interested and decided to kind of formalize my research by starting the blog. So no.
Well, thank you for doing that for us. And then she also asked if you're doing something similar in Wyoming, or do you have any plans to do so? Which I think I would like to add on to that too. You lived in Missouri for so long and focused a lot on Missouri women. And now that you've spent some time in a different state, so in addition to answering Kay's question about, any plans for Wyoming, do you see it, a difference in how these two different states treat women's history, or do you find that, you're seeing a similar issue where, there's just not a lot of resources out there, or there's just not as much done to document women's history sites or, stories?
The biggest difference that comes to mind is just Wyoming is so much less populated. And so I don't think it's not hard to find the women's stories here because there's just been less people. I feel like, no, I don't have any plans to start another blog about Wyoming women, although that's interesting. I just don't really have the time to. But I think it's a bit easier to find out about Wyoming women, I think, than Missouri. It's just because there's less people in general in that way.
Betty it looks like she's suggesting a book. It's called Immigrant Women in the Settlement of Missouri by Burnett and Lovering. So if anybody's interested in, sounds like stories of immigrant women in Missouri, immigrant women in the settlement of Missouri. Anybody who wants to jot that down. Terry has a comment, and this is interesting because I kind of caught on to this too. The difference in pronunciation of, you say Duquesne, I think, for a Rose Philippine. And I grew up knowing it as Duquesne. So, that's interesting. I don't know if it's a regional thing or a local thing, but, in St. Louis and in this area, we've got quite a few. We've got Duquesne High School. There's, Sacred Heart Academy, like you said. And, so I think that's interesting. Is that the French pronunciation?
I really don't know. I don't know if that's some pronunciation I picked up when I lived in Southwest Missouri or what, but that's how I heard it pronounced. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And so Kay also wants to know, are you from Missouri originally?
No, I
Okay.
am originally from Illinois.
Okay. She asked where in Missouri you're from originally, but I'm not sure if you had said that you were originally from here or not. Let me make sure I'm not skipping over anybody. Comment that this was an awesome and informative presentation. I agree. We had someone comment on Facebook that this was a great job and thank you, and I would agree. Linda says, "Go Greta." Yeah, it looks like if anybody else has any other questions, please feel free to submit those in the next few seconds. But I'll go ahead and kind of wrap us up here. Greta, anything else you'd like to add before we start wrapping up?
The only thing I would like to add is if there are any stories that someone would like to have featured, just to email me. My email is on the blog.
And I'll include that in this chat box too. It's just Greta E. Russell, right, at Gmail?
Yep.
Okay. So I've put Greta's email address. I know I recognize a lot of names in our attendee list from people that are in the history, museum, cultural heritage industry. So I think if anybody has anything to add or any questions, definitely get in touch with Greta. I think this blog is really great. I stumbled upon it a couple different times as we were doing some research for some program planning for women's suffrage centennial last year, which of course kind of all got messed up with COVID. But I remembered seeing that blog as we started to kind of plan this program and wanting to do something for Women's History Month. So I'm glad that we were able to get in touch with you. And that you were able to put together such a really great and informative presentation. Actually, one more comment. Ellen says, thanks for a great presentation. I hope to correspond regarding some work that AAUW of St. Louis branch has done with St. Louis notable women. And she sends an email address that I'll forward on to you. Did you see that there on the comments, or would you like me to send that to you?
I did not see it.
Okay, I'll go ahead and send that to you then, so that you guys can maybe correspond. But yeah, I believe that's I think that's it from us, everybody. I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen and to want to learn more. And again, this will be available on mohumanities.org/videos sometime in the next several days. It'll be immediately available on our Facebook page for later viewing. So feel free to watch it again or share it far and wide. And if you're interested in seeing more from us, we have a list of all of our upcoming programs and events on our website, mohumanities.org, and that's /events, mohumanities.org/events. So thank you, Greta, once again for a great presentation. And again, my name's Caitlin Yeager. I'm the Director of Heritage Programs, and I appreciate all of you guys tuning in with us. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and enjoy the spring weather that hopefully looks like it's here to stay. So bye, everybody. Thanks again.